Hey everyone, my name's Brian. I'm back again to do another literature review. And today I'm channeling my inner Icelander because I am very excited to say that I've fallen down the rabbit hole on Icelandic literature and I am deeply impressed. So I want to share with you some of the things that I am discovering about the small but mighty country of Iceland and how much they've given us in terms of great literature, at least a little bit that I'm learning about. But here I have my buddy Claude, the puffin. I love puffins, and there are lots of puffins in Iceland. Here in the States, we have, I think they're only in one state, Maine, but I have been to Maine and I've seen the puffins. They're one of my favorite birds, and I'd love to go to Iceland to see them there. I haven't had the pleasure, but one day, God willing, I will. The reason why I am so fascinated with Iceland right now is this book. This kicked it all off. This is actually The Raven's Nest. It's a memoir written by a woman named Sarah Thomas. Sarah is a filmmaker and a photographer, and she goes to Iceland. While she's there for a conference, she falls in love with an Icelandic man. And the book is about her experiences living in Iceland and really getting immersed in the culture and family life. And what I enjoy so much, and not just enjoy but really adore about the book, is the way that she translates the natural beauty of Iceland and really transports the reader to these wonderful exotic locations. Like, I've read very few authors that can take the natural world and really paint it into a picture that the reader can view and then feel a part of, but then not only visualize it but actually feel the emotions that she's feeling as she's experiencing these wonderful geographic features that the nation of Iceland is known for. So Sarah does a great job of doing that in her book, The Raven's Nest. Reading that book really sent me down the rabbit hole on Icelandic literature. I just became so fascinated with the nation and the culture, and God willing, I will be able to go there one day. If you watch a lot of BookTube like I do, and you're interested in Iceland, you'll eventually run across a man named Halldór Laxness. He wrote a very famous book, at least a lot of people will review it here on BookTube, called Independent People. And that book, it really is a work of genius. I'm so impressed with the way that Halldór Laxness can write characters. So I don't want to talk too much about this book right now because I have a lot of thoughts about it, but I just wanted to kind of give an overview of where I am right now in terms of my journey with Icelandic literature. But what I did want to talk about today was that one thing I noticed about independent people, and this is the impression I get from reading about Icelandic literature and then watching a lot of BookTube videos and people talking about it, is that Icelandic literature very often incorporates Icelandic fairy tales and Nordic myths and Norse mythology. So one thing I wanted to do was kind of build my foundation in Norse mythology. I don't know much about it, and so I wanted to build that foundation before I move on into more of the Icelandic literature. And this is how I did it. If it's helpful to anyone who wants to do the same thing, at least to give myself a little introduction, what I did was I listened to this course given by Professor Crawford. I think his name is Jackson Crawford, I'm sorry. And the course is available for free. At least it was for me, because I pay for the Audible membership. It's just called Norse Mythology, and I think it's like 8 hours long. And in the course, Professor Crawford gives a very good broad overview of the framework of where the myths come from, and a little bit about the culture and the religious practices. So I highly recommend that course as a way to kind of break in if you're completely unfamiliar with Norse mythology like I was before I started. So there's the course, but then I also read this book. This is the Prose Edda. The Prose Edda by Snorri Sturluson. It's very much part of the Icelandic literary heritage, because Snorri was an Icelander, and he was an Icelandic chieftain, and he wrote this book in the 1200s in Iceland. At that time, Iceland had converted to Christianity about 200 years earlier, in the year 1000. About then, Snorri is very interested in preserving the Norse myths and mythology, and so he wrote the Prose Edda. It's an interesting book. It's divided into 3 main sections. It's a relatively short book, so most of this, or a lot of this, is introduction and notes and things like that. So I think it's only around 140 pages of actual text with stories. So the first section is a prologue. And the prologue is interesting to me because what Snorri does is he kind of contextualizes the Norse myths, or the development of the Norse mythology, within the context of the Christian worldview. And he begins with the story of Genesis and God's creation of the world, and then he also, in the prologue, he connects sort of the migration of the Norse people to Troy. And I didn't know this, but this is a common motif for medieval writers, is to kind of connect to Troy. Virgil also does that in the Aeneid. He connects the founders of Rome with the descendants of Troy. So interesting to me. But why do we as humans, we kind of want to identify with those that were defeated? So we connect with the Trojans more than we connect with the Greeks that actually won the war. Kind of an interesting thing that we do. But so that's the prologue, and then the main part of the book, where the myths are, is in the second part, where there's a king, which I think he's from Sweden. He goes to the realm of the gods, Asgard, and he meets there 3, I guess they're gods. I think they're supposed to be Odin in various versions. Hey y'all, this is future Brian popping in here with some edits, because I realized that this portion of the video doesn't make much sense. So the point I'm trying to make is that the Swedish king goes to Asgard and he asks the 3 versions of Odin various questions around the origin of the Norse cosmos, the Battle of Ragnarok, and some of the principal stories around the major gods like Thor, Odin, Freya, Loki, and some others. So that's where you're going to get those stories. And there's also stories surrounding some major human heroes, like my favorite, Sigurd the Dragon Slayer. But hope that makes sense. That's the point I'm trying to make for the second section of the Prose Edda. Okay, back to your regularly scheduled programming. Other things that I thought were interesting, there's also some discussion of trolls and dwarves and elves and other mythical figures. So like, I had kind of an idea of trolls and dwarfs and things like that from Tolkien, but the Norse conception of those beings is somewhat different. So it was interesting to see the differences, but also the similarities, because you could see certain areas where Tolkien draws inspiration. One thing that touched me as I was reading the myths is Balder. So Balder is the son of Odin and Frigg. When I picture the Norse gods, like I always kind of picture them like Thor. Thor's, he's a noble guy, but he's also pretty violent, and he's gonna do what he needs to do. He's always fighting, and he's gonna, he's not afraid to get bloody. But Balder is kind of different. Balder seems to me to be all good. He's just good, kind, and the Prose Edda describes him as being sort of full of light, full of goodness. The story of what happens to Balder just kind of broke my heart, and I think about it quite often since I've read the story. I mean, not to give anything away, but Balder gets betrayed, and I'll leave it at that. Through Balder's life, you see a tender side of Odin. He has great love for his son, and the myth really shows that. And also Frigg, she has a real tenderness for Balder, which was touching. So I definitely recommend reading that myth regarding Balder and what happens to him. And in the third part of the Prose Edda is really something I did not expect. It's really a manual for writing poetry. I think that Snorri was not very happy about the influence of English and French poetry in Iceland at the time, so he wanted to preserve sort of the very unique way that the Norse write poetry, or how they did write poetry. So the third section of the book doesn't really have too many myths in it. There's some, but most of it is just really a manual for someone if you want to be a proper Norse poet, I guess, however Snorri would define that. This is how you do it. And he talks a lot about something called keenings. I know there's a technical definition of it, but to me it was alliteration. For instance, take a ship. In the third section of the Prose Edda, the man will ask a question. So, how should I refer to a ship? And then the answer will be, well, you can refer to a ship as a seahorse, because ships ride the waves and sailors ride ships like they might ride a horse. Hey guys, this is future Brian, and I realized I owe you all an apology. I seriously messed up my poetry terminology, and my friend Claude, the puffin here, has been staring disapprovingly at me. Let me correct a few things. Please forgive me. Number one, saying something like a ship is a seahorse is definitely not alliteration. It's a metaphor. Alliteration is when you're emphasizing the same sound over and over again. So it's something like grim, Grendel, greedy, grim, Grendel. So that's alliteration. You're emphasizing that strong G sound. Describing a ship as a seahorse would be a metaphor. Now, keening, the way that I was saying it in the video, keening is actually a lament, usually for someone that died. But the way that the system of Norse metaphor, I think, is conning, is the way you say it, the correct way to say it. I hope I'm saying it correctly. But they're referring to metaphor. So ship is a seahorse, blood would be like battle sweat. So, hope that clears things up. All right, back to our regular scheduled programming. And it's all things like that. Like, and then another question will be, how should I refer to the sun? And he'll list some ways that you can describe the sun, or how can I refer to Thor? And there will be, these are the various names of Thor that you can incorporate into poems, and like the scourge of giants, something like that, because he's always fighting giants. So that's the Prose Edda. And I definitely recommend reading the Prose Edda first. There's really only two primary sources for Norse mythology: the Prose Edda, and then this book, which is the Poetic Edda. Here it's called the Elder Edda. Sometimes it's called the Elder Edda. But so there's the prose and the Poetic Edda. And I would definitely recommend reading the Prose Edda first, because the prose are really kind of straightforward and easy to understand. So I think that if I tried to read the Poetic Edda first, for me, as not being familiar at all with Norse mythology, it would be really difficult, because the Poetic Edda, much like the name says, they're poems. So you're going to get a lot of the same myths that are in the Prose Edda, but they're in poetic form. And whoever wrote the Prose Edda, it was also written in Iceland around the 1200s, but they don't know who wrote it. The main source material is the Codex Regius, which is in Iceland. And Snorri quotes the Poetic Edda in the Prose Edda, so there's a lot of overlap. But this book, the Poetic Edda, is really interesting, and I think quite beautiful, in that there is a section called the Havamal, which is kind of like the Book of Proverbs in the Bible, but it's Norse wisdom. I want to just read one, just so you get an idea. So, and this also taught me too about the drastic difference there are in different translations that you can get of the Poetic Edda, because it's written in Old Norse, and I guess that Icelandic is the closest language to Old Norse, but I'm not sure, at least from the variants of translations that I saw, that there's a real agreement on how to translate it. Because I looked at this one particular verse that I'm about to read. This is one of the wisdom sayings of Odin in the Havamal section of the Poetic Edda. And there's a website where you can see like 6 different translations of the same verse, and they're vastly different. So I'm not sure that there's real agreement on how to translate Old Norse. But let me just read it. So this is stanza 95 in Havamal. So in this version, which is the Penguin Classic version, it was translated by a man named Andy Orchard. It says, the mind alone knows what lives near the heart. Alone it sees into the soul. Worse for the wise than any disease, finding nothing that makes one content. Now let me read the same verse in this translation, which is Poems of the Elder Edda, and the translator is Patricia Terry. And I really enjoyed this translation, and actually I listened to the audiobook. So I read the Penguin Classic version, then I also listened to the audiobook version of the Poetic Edda as translated by Patricia Terry. And I highly recommend, if you're going to listen to the audiobook version, that you would get the version translated by Patricia Terry. The cast of readers that they have reading the various poems are really fantastic. There's one woman who, whoever reads the first poem, she has just such a soothing voice. I really enjoyed the sections that she read. And there's also a man that has sort of a German kind of accent who reads the sections attributed to Odin. So the same verse, you remember the way that Andy Orchard translated. This is how Patricia Terry translates. This is stanza 95 of the Havamal, Sayings of the High One. She says, "Only you can know what lies near the heart. See clearly into yourself. For the wise man, no sickness is worse than nothing left to love." So, to me, this version sounds much more poetic. And again, that's nothing against Andy Orchard in the way that he translated, because I have no idea which version is actually closer to the Old Norse. But to me, Andy Orchard says, makes a man content, and then Patricia Terry says, for the wise man, there is nothing worse than nothing left to love. So there's a great difference in the way that I think about the word content and then the word love. Where love has so much passion. I mean, love is something that you're willing to die for, potentially, whereas contentment is just, I feel satisfied. So a very different word with very different feelings and emotions attached to it. So that's the Poetic Edda. And in the Poetic Edda, I think another difference is from the Prose Edda is that in the Poetic Edda, along with the myths about the gods and the legendary families, there's more context. So there's more myths about legendary families and some greater detail into Sigurd and Sigurd's family and his descendants, and then there's stories about Valkyries, in particular a woman named Brunhild, who is a pretty impressive figure. I enjoyed reading about her. But that's my impressions of the Prose Edda, the Poetic Edda, and my initial sticking my foot into studying the Norse mythology. But hey guys, this is Future Brian again, and Claude. We're just popping on to give you a quick overview of some other Icelandic literature we will be diving into in future videos in case you're interested in following along. First, I have this gigantic brick called The Sagas of the Icelanders, which I will be taking on in bite-sized pieces whenever I have some time. There's also this one, another one by Halldór Laxness called Worldlight, which I'm excited to read. And finally, I have this one, which is really a collection of photographs with a little bit of history by John Krakauer. He's one of my favorite authors, and David Roberts. I will be including links in the description to any of these books that I mentioned during the video, any audiobooks and classes as resources for anybody who is interested. Thank you so much for sticking with Claude and I through this whole video. We really appreciate it, and we hope to see you on the next one.